Are we used to bad arguments because they're popular, or are they popular because people keep pushing them and we just can't drown out the noise? Or do we not know the difference between something that's a good working argument and one that blows chunks? Thinking isn't easy, which is why our brains take shortcuts. And sometimes when we take these shortcuts, things are fine, like focusing our perception on a particular object and missing details that are on the periphery. And other times we might rely on our brains to fill in details that are missing from our perception or from our experiences because we can't take in everything all at once. Or even with memories, for example. Maybe we remember something because we have a mnemonic device, or I don't know, like we're able to remember like a cool fact about a Pokemon, like before he got into cage fighting, Geodude was really into cognitive neuroscience. Now, there are times when the shortcuts in our thinking can really take this thinking off the rails. Even when we have the best of intentions, we can end up making some serious cognitive mistakes, which lead us into really weird justifications for things. Like, let's say you completely innocently believe that the moon is made out of cheese, and that means that now you have to justify the kind of cheese and how it's made and where the milk comes from and where are the lunar cows. And all of this is because you accepted someone's word one time that, well, the moon is made out of lunar cheese, and you've built a complicated cognitive lattice work all around it. And this leads us to this unit's topic: cognitive problems and logical fallacies. When we talk about cognitive problems, we're usually talking about the temptation for us to take mental shortcuts. And when we talk about logical fallacies, we are talking about common mistakes made in arguments that end up undermining the claims that we are trying to make. When fallacies are intentionally used, that is, when someone is purposely using faulty logic or logical contradictions in order to persuade, we refer to this as sophistry. And when it's taken to its most extreme, we refer to it as BS. In this video, we'll be covering the basic problems of thinking before moving on to talking about the three main kinds of fallacies. Now, there are tons of fallacies, and so I won't be able to cover all of them, but I'll cover some of the most famous and common ones, and for the rest of them, you're just going to have to read that for yourself. When we encounter claims in the world, there are several kinds of conflict or kinds of challenge that we need to wrestle with in order to evaluate these ideas. We have to evaluate claims on the basis of our own background knowledge, but also how we weigh these claims when compared to expert opinion, or how we think about them within the context of our own personal experience and what we do with contrary evidence. So, we're going to examine each of these areas a bit more, beginning with background information. Now, when we're talking about background information, we're talking about our existing beliefs and knowledge of the world, how we receive a claim and how we categorize that claim. The more we know about something, the more likely we are to have a stronger opinion about it. And we might connect more strongly to something that references one of our past experiences or a course that we've taken in school, even though the claim itself might be rather dubious. For example, let's say that you've taken a class about geography and you know that Bolivia is in South America and people speak Spanish in that region of the world. So somebody says there are like 37 official languages in the plurinational state of Bolivia. You might be suspicious of this claim because you know that Spanish is what millions of people in South America speak, and your inference about the Spanish language is correct. It's just not completely correct. See, if you examine the evidence, you would find that the 37 official languages claim is more correct than just speaking Spanish. And maybe you knew that about Bolivia, or maybe you don't, but the evidence points to there being 37. When we're wrestling with claims in terms of our background knowledge, we have to keep a few things in mind. First, we have to proportion our belief relative to the evidence. If we're familiar with a claim, we might need to evaluate it on the basis of the evidence that is present for it, rather than pulling out a few random facts that we know about Bolivia because we took geography once or something like that. Additionally, it's not reasonable to believe a claim if there are no good reasons to believe it. That is, if we're presented with claims that are dogmatic or meant to be accepted simply on the basis of belief and not really with any justification. And I'm bracketing religious beliefs here because I think that they function a bit differently than other types of claims, but many claims like uh, Western society is a meritocracy, the Civil Rights Act eliminated segregation entirely. People take these things dogmatically without looking at the good reasons to believe that they may or may not be the case, or looking at the actual evidence that you're presented with. You got to look at the evidence and proportion your belief according to the evidence you're presented with. When it comes to claims versus expert opinion, there are some other elements we have to keep in mind. Within the context of logic and argumentation, we think of experts as people who have extensive knowledge in a particular area, and they can offer plenty of support for both their expertise in an area and about claims in that area. People who have that expertise in that particular field are able to act as an expert or an authority in that field. I qualify who counts as an expert because there are plenty of people who lack expertise but nonetheless act as though they are an expert. There are people who, are good at going to the gym, who claim to be health experts at the same level as somebody who has a medical degree in physiology, cellular biology, human nutrition, etc., right? Like, I have a PhD in philosophy, but I'm not about to pretend that being a doctor of philosophy qualifies me to perform emergency appendectomies in the back of a shared Uber ride to the airport. I'm not giving you medical advice because I'm not that kind of a doctor. I'm just a philosophy guy. Experts are usually experts in a specific field. Their expertise is targeted rather than broad and universally applicable. And as a result, we can take some cues from legitimate experts. If an expert expresses skepticism about a claim, we have good reason to doubt it. And if a significant number of experts are in disagreement about a topic, we have good reason to doubt any claim to it being settled. Now, this is contrasted with the idea that if experts, so called, are committing factual errors, making straw man arguments, engaging in logical contradictions, we have reason to doubt that expert. In other words, don't listen to a Spotify exclusive podcasting thick boy for your medical advice. Listen to an actual medical professional. They're an expert. Our personal experience is another source of agreement or contention when it comes to evaluating arguments. If we expect a situation or process to unfold in a certain way, that can color how we think about a situation or a process in their actuality. Now, along these lines, our minds are tempted to agree with something like the gambler's fallacy, which is a defect in reasoning that assumes that previous events can affect probabilities in random future events. We might come to expect, for example, that wearing our team's kit during a match will help them score more goals than the opposing side. And this is assuming that our ability to wear a particular piece of clothing can have impact on events that are completely unrelated to it. Your stinky jersey ain't going to make the keeper save that penalty no matter how hard you want to believe it. Personal experience is just that. It's personal. And it's rarely able to affect larger events beyond what we might be immediately responsible for. So we have to take our personal experiences with a grain of salt. And this leads us to one of the most common and dangerous temptations that we have to contend with. Two kinds of biases: confirmation bias and Availability bias. Confirmation bias is the way that we safeguard our existing beliefs against contrary evidence. It can lead to us accepting positions that are untrue, seeing relationships that simply don't exist, and finding confirmation of a belief that isn't really genuine confirmation. We can see this in so many diehard conspiracy believers refusing to use a cell phone because 5G is giving you COVID, or claiming that gasoline can't melt steel beams and therefore 9/11 was an inside job, or that horse medicine is better for you than a vaccine. But beyond this, refusing to engage with contrary evidence, that is a sign of confirmation bias. And it can take very subtle forms, not just the, tinfoil hat wearing kind. When we're confronted with information that contradicts our beliefs, we can scrutinize that information far more strongly than we would any information that supports our existing beliefs. Or we can simply ignore that contrary information. And this is related to another temptation that we might have: availability bias. Availability bias is reliance on evidence that is psychologically available to us rather than what is good, justifiable evidence. For example, if I had a discussion with somebody who refuses to believe that flying is less dangerous than driving a car, I would probably try to present the very credible, long standing statistical evidence that there are exponentially more deaths due to automobiles every year than there are with anybody flying. But because car travel is so much more familiar to us, somebody is going to say, well, my available information points me to thinking that car driving is much safer. It is intuitively dubious to believe that flying in the sky in a tin can is safer. Now, these common errors that we find, we can recognize, and we can work to have our mental habits correct them. Anybody can make these errors. It doesn't matter your political affiliation or your religious beliefs, or who you main in Overwatch. For me, it's Soldier 76 because I'm a dad and I'm old, right? We need to take time to address these errors. And speaking of errors, let's talk about some fallacies. When we're talking about fallacies, we're really talking about three main forms of defective argumentation: fallacies with irrelevant premises, fallacies with unacceptable premises, and rhetorical moves designed towards being persuasive, even if they're not entirely truthful. Now, we'll get into each of these kinds of fallacies generally, and I'll try and touch on some of the most egregious versions of these fallacies so that you can see that most of them begin from a noteworthy or praiseworthy inference, and then they quickly go off the rails. Fallacies with irrelevant premises include premises that have no bearing on the conclusion. These premises don't provide reasons for backing up or believing a claim that makes the conclusion of an argument. They're simply there because, I guess, one must have premises. Examples of this type of fallacy include some of the following: the genetic fallacy, which erroneously believes that an argument is bad because of how it came to be or where it came from. We hear this all the time from political commentators. We might hear one say, this infrastructure repair research originated from the Heritage Foundation and therefore it cannot be trusted, or this study on the efficacy of bike transportation was conducted by people educated in one of those leftist university programs and therefore we shouldn't engage with it at all. In both of these cases, the research being conducted is not directly related to anything resembling the ideological agenda of the institutions referenced. And while the Heritage Foundation might be a conservative think tank, basic research is not going to be suspect, even coming from a place that has an ideological agenda. If we weren't talking about basic research, but instead we're talking about, say, a policy proposal, that might be something worth offering up skepticism about. The good impulse that's at the bottom of this is to doubt when people have an agenda that might align with misrepresenting information or skipping steps in order to persuade you to agree or adopt their way of thinking. You have to present reasons. Another important fallacy to note is the ad hominem argument, particularly in its two coke and poison the well formulations. Ad hominem is what we might call the individual version of the genetic fallacy, where the credibility of an individual is being challenged rather than the context of the argument itself. And we can see this very often in the two coke example, which is kind of like the yeah, but you too, or like, but you're the problem too version of it. You might hear somebody say, like, you came here in an airplane to challenge us about curbing fossil fuel consumption in order to challenge climate change or whatever, right? And so one might think that one is attacking hypocrisy when in reality, what you're doing is you're not engaging with the argument itself. You are saying, well, you did this thing, so therefore your argument is moot. It's not always the case. In like manner, with poison the well, what we have is something where somebody makes, say, one dubious claim and one believes that, oh, the entire well of information has been poisoned by a dubious claim. But somebody making one reasoning mistake accidentally doesn't mean that everything they say is unbelievable. There are also fallacies like the red herring, which is including irrelevant information, the non sequitur, including completely unrelated information, and the straw man, where one purposely misrepresents the views of an opponent and attacks that misrepresentation. These are all versions of that same kind of bad premise type of fallacy. Finally, we have a few appeals to consider here. We have the appeal to popularity that basically argues thing popular, therefore thing good, or famous person says thing is good, therefore thing good. Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's good. This is fairly obvious. Same is true of the appeal to tradition, which is basically laziness. And then we have the appeal to ignorance. And this one is the fallacy where the absence of evidence against a claim is used to prove that it is true. So one can say, you have no evidence that I did not see aliens in the sky while driving through the Arizona desert in 1985. And that's just not how arguments work. You can't use negative information to support a positive claim in that regard. The absence of evidence doesn't mean the presence of evidence for the positive or in favor of an argument. Now, next we have fallacies that are, how should I put it? They have dubious relationships between the premises and the conclusion. So, for example, you have one of the most important ones that is the begging the question fallacy. This is not the same thing as when people say something like, this begs the question, and then they ask a question. So somebody is like, Legos are actually just 3D puzzles, which begs the question, what items made up of tiny parts aren't 3D puzzles? That's not begging the question. That's just using the phrase begging the question to ask a question. In this context, begging the question is a bit more complicated and comes in a few iterations. In its most classic formulation, begging the question is an argument whose premises assume that the conclusion is correct before they arrive at the conclusion. So you might have an argument like, the government is hiding the reality that the volcano under Yellowstone National Park is going to erupt and just destroy half of the U.S. population. The government monitors these natural disasters and draws up contingency plans that are almost never wrong, so therefore the fact that we don't know about the day it will erupt, even though we have good reason to believe the government does know, means that they're hiding it from us, and that's how they get you. This argument is dumb, but also it begins by believing that the government is hiding something only to arrive at the conclusion that the government is hiding something. Even if this information were true, which it's not, it's a dumb argument I made up after Googling a list of popular conspiracy theories. The formulation of the argument here demonstrates one version of begging the question's structure. Another formulation might include burying the premise or using circular reasoning to arrive at a conclusion. One way to think about this fallacy is to pair it with confirmation bias. If we're tempted to overvalue information related to something that we already believe, then we might inadvertently construct arguments that are based on begging the question and not good reasoning. Now, other fallacies with unacceptable premises include the false dilemma fallacy. Either we ban the show Squid Game or people will hunt the wealthy for sport. False analogy fallacy, the slippery slope fallacy. If we let people change their names, then whenever they want, eventually someone's going to want to marry an iguana. That makes no sense. And it doesn't, because it demonstrates a dubious relationship, a doubtful relationship between the premises and the conclusion. We could easily point out, for example, that a slippery slope assumes that there's too strong of a causal chain of events, and that the end result of people wanting to change their name might just be that people want to change their name. Or people might find an analogy where they say that the relationship between Jim and Pam from The Office is exactly like that of Pikachu and Bulbasaur's, even though it makes no sense and you shouldn't just go with it. But people do these things all the time, which brings us to rhetorical moves, a lot of which we're very familiar with. The use of innuendos to imply a relationship or to imply character flaws. The same is true of stereotypes that reinforce racist and classist ideas meant to stir up fear, right? These techniques are designed to persuade us by actively misrepresenting the truth and actively trying to get us to be afraid or have some kind of emotional response. But when people are engaged in this, well, this is a technique that goes all the way back to Socrates. This is what we call sophistry. And sophistry, along with our own kind of cognitive pitfalls and sort of cognitive faults, right? Areas of improvement. This is why we need to learn about fallacies and why we need to be cognizant of the kinds of biases and obstacles to critical thinking that are out there. Because it's very, very easy for us to just go along with reasoning that is fallacious, that is error-laden, that is lacking in strong quality evidence and strong ties between the premises and the conclusion. And if we're not aware of this, then we can be perpetrating untruths. We can be perpetrating arguments that we end up believing dogmatically rather than on the basis of sound justification for believing that claim. And then on top of that, there are people who are trying to sell you something. They might be trying to sell you something that you don't need, like, I don't know, a second Nintendo Switch. Why do you need two Switches? Right? There's probably a reason for it. If you can justify it, I'm not going to judge. But on the other hand, there are people who are trying to sell you a lifestyle. They're trying to sell you a way of existing in the world. They're trying to sell you a message of fear that is not based on evidence, but is based on some sort of latent concern you might have. And this is why we need to evaluate these things clearly and, well, critically. Because without that, we're just stuck believing untruths. Thinking is hard, and in the long run, it's even harder when we take cognitive shortcuts, like using fallacious reasoning. Adios.